You never expect a simple evening to turn into a moment that changes everything, especially when the person calling the police has no idea who they're actually reporting. That's exactly what happened the night she claimed we had blocked the street. What she didn't know was that every single person standing there was off-duty law enforcement, and the truth was about to explode in ways nobody saw coming. It started quietly. Our small neighborhood gathering wasn't loud, wild, or disruptive. A few vehicles were parked along the curb while friends, most of us off-duty officers who had served together, talked and laughed after a long week. It felt safe, familiar, and normal. The kind of calm evening where nothing remarkable should happen. Then she appeared. The law enforcer everyone knew, sharp voice, clipboard always in hand, constantly watching for rule violations. She marched toward us with visible irritation, insisting we were creating an obstruction. We tried explaining that emergency vehicles could still pass and that we'd be done soon. But she wasn't listening. Instead, she warned us that she would call the police if we didn't move immediately. Nobody argued. We just exchanged quiet glances. Some of us even smiled. Because she had no idea. Minutes later, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A patrol car rolled up slowly, lights flashing but sirens silent. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Phones came out. The scene suddenly felt heavier, more dramatic, exactly what she wanted. The officer stepped out, calm and professional. Before he could say anything, the wall woman rushed over, pointing aggressively at us and explaining how we were blocking public access and refusing to cooperate. Her confidence grew with every word. Then the officer looked at us. Recognition flashed across his face. "Wait, you guys," he said. The mood shifted instantly. One by one, he recognized familiar faces, officers from nearby precincts, veterans of shared training, people he'd worked with for years. The realization hit everyone standing nearby at the same time. The accused weren't reckless residents. They were cops. The wall woman's expression changed from confident to confused. She tried to continue her complaint, but the officer gently asked her to step back while he assessed the situation properly. Measurements were taken, visibility checked, traffic flow observed. Nothing was blocked, nothing was unsafe. The officer calmly explained that no laws were being broken. The street remained fully accessible, and the gathering was peaceful. Around us, neighbors began whispering, the energy shifting from tension to quiet embarrassment. But the story didn't end there. Because as the officer spoke, one of my platoon members quietly mentioned something important. This wasn't the first complaint she'd made. In fact, several neighbors had similar experiences. The officer paused, and suddenly, the night stopped being about parked vehicles. It became about a pattern. The kind of pattern police don't ignore. And that's when everything truly began. The moment the officer realized this wasn't an isolated complaint, the energy on the street changed completely. What began as a simple call about parked vehicles suddenly felt heavier, like the surface of something much bigger had just cracked. The wall representative still stood nearby, arms crossed, waiting for validation. Instead, she watched the officer shift his attention away from us and toward questions she clearly wasn't expecting. "Have there been previous reports involving this group?" he asked calmly. She hesitated. That pause didn't go unnoticed. One of my platoon members stepped forward and quietly explained that neighbors had been dealing with similar issues for months: random complaints, aggressive warnings, and repeated threats involving police involvement. Some residents stopped hosting gatherings altogether. Others received written notices from the WA for minor or questionable violations. It sounded less like community management and more like intimidation. The officer listened carefully, taking notes. Around us, more neighbors began stepping outside. At first they only watched, but slowly a few started speaking. One elderly man mentioned receiving a warning for parking slightly outside painted lines, despite doing it the same way for years. A young couple said they'd been reported for noise complaints during a quiet dinner with family. Another neighbor admitted she avoided talking outside because she felt constantly watched. The stories kept coming. The officer's expression changed from routine professionalism to focused concern. Patterns mattered in police work. And what he was hearing sounded like repeated misuse of emergency services for personal enforcement. Meanwhile, the WA representative tried to regain control. She insisted everything was about maintaining standards, protecting property values, and keeping order. But the more she spoke, the more defensive she sounded. Her earlier confidence was fading. I noticed something then. She wasn't just angry about the parked cars. She was angry about losing authority in front of an audience. The officer asked her for official documentation supporting the complaint. She pulled out papers quickly, almost too quickly, as if she expected this moment. But when he reviewed them, details didn't align with actual city regulations. The street width measurements were wrong. Emergency access claims were exaggerated. He looked back at her. Calmly, firmly. "This isn't a police issue," he said. The words landed hard. A quiet wave of relief moved through the crowd, but the officer wasn't finished. He explained that repeated non-emergency calls could become a problem if used improperly. That warning alone made several neighbors exchange surprised looks. Few realized that calling the police unnecessarily could itself raise concerns. Then something unexpected happened. Dispatch radio crackled from the patrol car. Another officer confirmed that similar complaints had come from the same caller over the past months. Different residents, different reasons, same outcome. No violation found. The officer went silent for a moment. He turned back toward us and lowered his voice. "If this keeps happening," he said, "we may need to look deeper." That statement changed everything. This wasn't just about one night anymore. It wasn't even about an HOA dispute. It felt like the first chapter of something bigger, something slowly coming into focus under flashing streetlights and curious eyes. And as the crowd began to disperse, one thought stayed with me. Tonight didn't end a problem. It started an investigation. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't loud or dramatic. Just quieter, heavier, like everyone was thinking about what had happened. People who usually hurried past each other slowed down. Curtains moved slightly as residents watched the street. The police had left peacefully the night before, but their questions lingered. And for the first time, people were wondering if the problem had never been the parked vehicles at all. I met with a few members of my platoon later that day. Most of us lived nearby or visited regularly, and we couldn't ignore how uncomfortable the neighborhood had become. One officer mentioned that he'd seen similar patterns before. Situations where authority inside small communities slowly turned into pressure, and pressure turned into control. We decided to talk to residents informally. What we heard surprised even us. A single mother explained how she'd received multiple wall warnings about things that were never clearly defined. Trash cans, flower pots, even the color of a porch light. Another neighbor said he paid several fines just to avoid conflict, even though he believed they were unfair. People weren't angry. They were exhausted. Many simply wanted peace. The biggest surprise came from an older veteran who lived 2 streets over. He quietly admitted that he stopped inviting family over because he feared complaints. "It's easier to stay invisible," he said. That sentence stuck with me. Later that afternoon, Officer Daniels, the same patrol officer from the night before, stopped by. He wasn't officially investigating yet, but he wanted clarity. He explained that repeated calls from one individual weren't automatically suspicious, but when calls consistently turned out to be unfounded, it raised questions. That's when we showed him something interesting. One of our guys had kept records, dates, times, and notes about past encounters involving law enforcement. Nothing illegal, just personal documentation. When Daniels compared those notes with dispatch logs on his tablet, similarities appeared. Complaints clustered around certain residents. Events were reported differently than what witnesses described. The pattern was becoming clearer. Meanwhile, the WA representative started making rounds in the neighborhood, speaking to residents directly. She framed the previous night as a misunderstanding, insisting she only wanted safety. But the tone felt different now. More urgent, like she realized control was slipping. And that's when the story took another turn. A neighbor approached us quietly after sunset. He said he'd been part of HOA meetings and had seen discussions that felt wrong. Decisions made without full votes, selective enforcement against people who disagreed publicly. He hesitated before speaking, clearly nervous. Then he said something that changed everything. "There's paperwork you haven't seen," he whispered. He promised to gather what he could. As we stood there, the street lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. For the first time, it felt less like a neighborhood disagreement and more like something deeper, something that had been hidden behind rules and complaints. Police attention had started because of a single call about blocked streets. Now it was heading somewhere nobody expected. And we all knew one thing for sure. The next step was going to be bigger than anyone was ready for. The following evening, the neighborhood felt unusually still. Even the usual sounds, kids playing, dogs barking, doors opening, seemed quieter, as if everyone sensed something was coming. We gathered at my place, waiting for the neighbor who promised to bring the documents. None of us said much. Off-duty or not, we all understood the same rule: facts matter more than assumptions. When he finally arrived, he carried a plain folder tucked under his arm. His hands shook slightly as he handed it over. He explained that these were copies, meeting notes, internal memos, and notices that had never been shared publicly. He didn't want trouble, he just wanted things to be fair again. We opened the folder. At first glance, it looked like ordinary WA paperwork. But the more we read, the more uncomfortable the room became. Notes discussed consistent enforcement strategies, aimed at specific houses. There were references to escalating complaints when residents resisted fines. One line even suggested involving law enforcement, to encourage compliance. Silence filled the room. Officer Daniels, who had joined us quietly after finishing his shift, read through the documents carefully. His expression didn't change, but the way he paused at certain lines told us everything. None of this was automatically criminal. HOAs had authority to enforce rules, but using police resources as pressure crossed into dangerous territory. Then we noticed something else. Several complaints listed in the documents didn't match actual police reports. Dates were missing. Descriptions were exaggerated. Some incidents appeared to have been rewritten to sound more serious. Daniels leaned back slowly. "This explains the pattern," he said. Outside, neighbors began gathering again, drawn by curiosity. Rumors traveled fast. The story was no longer about a blocked street, it was about trust breaking apart. Before we could decide what to do next, a black SUV pulled up nearby. The WA representative stepped out, walking quickly toward the group. She demanded to know why people were meeting without official authorization. Her voice was firm, but something about it felt strained. Daniels stepped forward calmly and identified himself. The confrontation stopped instantly. She tried to explain that internal documents were being misinterpreted, that enforcement needed structure, that some residents refused cooperation. But as she spoke, more neighbors joined the conversation, sharing experiences, asking questions, challenging things they once accepted without thinking. The balance of power shifted right there on the sidewalk. Daniels didn't accuse anyone. He simply requested that official WA records be provided voluntarily for review, explaining that repeated emergency calls tied to internal strategies deserved clarification. Her face tightened. She agreed reluctantly. As she walked back to her vehicle, I could sense the tension rising. This wasn't over, not even close. In fact, it felt like we had just stepped onto a much bigger stage. Later that night, Daniels called dispatch and quietly requested a review of previous incidents connected to the neighborhood. The response came quickly. Multiple unfounded reports, all tied to similar complaints. He looked at us and said something that stayed with me. "If the records match what you're showing me," he said, "this becomes a different conversation." The wind moved through the quiet street. The folder sat open on the table, pages shifting slightly. And for the first time, it felt like truth had a real chance of coming out, even if someone desperately wanted it hidden. 2 days later, the WA scheduled an emergency community meeting. Flyers appeared on doors early in the morning, urging residents to attend. The message claimed there had been misunderstandings involving law enforcement, and promised clarification. But everyone already knew this wasn't going to be a normal meeting. Word had spread about the documents, the repeated calls, and the police review quietly happening behind the scenes. By evening, the community hall was packed. Neighbors who rarely spoke sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously. Some looked angry, others anxious. My platoon members and I stood near the back, not to intimidate anyone, but because we wanted to observe quietly. Officer Daniels arrived too, off-duty but present, blending into the crowd. The atmosphere felt like a pressure cooker waiting to release. The WA representative stepped to the front, her expression controlled but tense. She began with prepared remarks about safety, order, and protecting property values. She insisted the recent events were exaggerated and said the community needed unity, not conflict. For a moment, it almost worked. Then someone raised a hand. An older resident asked why certain homes received repeated warnings while others didn't. Another questioned why police were called so frequently for minor disputes. A younger couple asked why meeting notes had never been shared publicly. The questions kept coming. Her answers grew shorter. She repeated phrases about policy and responsibility, but the room sensed something different: uncertainty. The confidence she showed on the street the other night was fading quickly. Then Officer Daniels stood up. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply explained that law enforcement had observed a recurring pattern of complaints that resulted in no violations. He spoke calmly, emphasizing that misuse of emergency services could create serious concerns if intentional. The room went silent. One of my platoon members placed the folder of copied documents on a table near the front. Residents leaned forward, whispering as pages were opened. Seeing everything in writing changed the mood instantly. Notes about compliance pressure. Mentions of escalating enforcement when residents pushed back. Gasps spread across the room. The WA representative tried to object, saying the documents were private, but now people weren't listening the same way. The fear that once kept everyone quiet was turning into something else: courage. A woman in the front row stood and admitted she'd paid fines she never understood just to avoid stress. Another resident said he felt targeted after challenging a decision months earlier. Stories poured out faster than anyone expected. The meeting slipped out of control, not chaotic, but honest. Daniels stepped forward again, reminding everyone that the purpose wasn't to argue, but to clarify facts. He informed the room that official records would be reviewed and that cooperation would help resolve the situation fairly. For the first time, the WA representative looked genuinely shaken. As the meeting ended, small groups formed outside under streetlights, conversations buzzing with disbelief and relief. People realized they weren't alone anymore. The silence that once protected the system was gone. Walking back to my car, I felt something shift. This wasn't about one complaint or one night anymore. It was about a community waking up. And the next move wouldn't come from residents. It would come from the police. The morning after the meeting felt unreal. The neighborhood wasn't quiet anymore, it was waiting. Residents stood outside longer than usual, watching every vehicle that entered the street. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors were now open and honest. People were no longer whispering about problems, they were asking what would happen next. We got the answer sooner than anyone expected. 2 patrol cars arrived just after noon, followed by an unmarked vehicle. Officers stepped out calmly, not rushing, not creating drama. Their presence alone was enough to make curtains shift and doors open. This wasn't an emergency response. It was something more deliberate. Officer Daniels walked toward the WA office with another supervisor beside him. They carried folders and a small evidence box, routine tools that suddenly made everything feel serious. My platoon members and I watched quietly from across the street. Off-duty or not, we understood the significance of this moment. The officers requested access to official records. At first, the WA representative resisted. She insisted lawyers needed to be involved and that documents were private. But the supervisor explained clearly that they were reviewing repeated calls for service and needed to verify information connected to those reports. The tone remained respectful, but firm. Eventually, she stepped aside. Boxes of files were brought out one by one. Financial statements, enforcement logs, complaint forms. Everything looked ordinary on the surface, yet the officers handled it carefully, knowing details mattered. Neighbors gathered nearby, trying to understand what they were seeing. Some looked relieved, others seemed nervous, as if unsure whether this would fix things or make them worse. Then something unexpected happened. Another officer arrived carrying printed dispatch records. He compared dates with the logs being removed from the office. Even from a distance, I could see the moment his posture changed, something matched. Or maybe something didn't. Daniels exchanged a quiet look with him. That look told us plenty. Inside the office, officers continued reviewing records. Occasionally they stepped out to make calls, speaking quietly into radios. The investigation was no longer informal, it had become official. The WA representative stood outside watching, arms folded tightly. The confidence she once projected was fading fast. Several residents approached her with questions, but she avoided direct answers, saying only that everything would be explained later. Meanwhile, neighbors started talking openly, comparing experiences, discussing fines, sharing letters they'd kept hidden in drawers. It felt like years of silence breaking all at once. One officer walked over to us and said something simple. "This goes deeper than we thought." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. By late afternoon, the officers loaded the last box into their vehicle. Daniels spoke briefly with the WA representative, explaining that the review would continue and that cooperation was expected moving forward. As the police drove away, the street felt different again, lighter, but uncertain. People didn't cheer. They just watched quietly, processing what had happened. I realized something then. For months, this community had been controlled by fear of rules and consequences. Now, the rules themselves were being questioned. And once that process starts, things rarely go back to the way they were. The investigation was real now. And the truth was getting closer. The days after the police collected the records felt longer than usual. Every small update spread quickly through the neighborhood. People checked their phones more often, stopped to talk in driveways, and watched for patrol cars the way they once watched for WA notices. The community wasn't afraid anymore. It was anxious to know what the investigation would reveal. Officer Daniels called me that evening. His voice was calm, but serious. "We're finding inconsistencies," he said. That was all he could share, but it was enough. Word traveled fast, and by nightfall residents were already speculating. Some believed this would end quietly. Others expected arrests. Nobody really knew what was coming. The next morning, 2 detectives arrived at several homes, including mine. They weren't accusatory. They were gathering statements. Residents were asked simple questions. How often complaints happened, whether fines felt justified, if anyone felt pressured into paying. One by one, neighbors told their stories. Patterns emerged quickly. Complaints were often tied to personal disagreements. Certain homes received repeated enforcement while others never did. Some notices referenced city codes that didn't exist. A few residents admitted they paid fees just to avoid being reported again. The detectives listened carefully, taking notes without interruption. Later that afternoon, the biggest development happened. A former WA board member contacted police voluntarily. He showed up with a small envelope and a nervous expression. Inside were emails, internal conversations discussing strategies to increase compliance by involving law enforcement when residents challenged decisions. Reading those messages felt like watching pieces of a puzzle snap together. Daniels didn't react emotionally, but his eyes said enough. This wasn't about misunderstandings anymore. It was about intent. Meanwhile, the WA representative tried to calm residents with another statement posted online, insisting everything was being taken out of context. But the tone had changed. Instead of authority, it sounded defensive. People responded with questions she couldn't easily answer. That evening, neighbors gathered again outside, this time not in fear but in solidarity. People who barely knew each other before now shared stories openly. The community felt closer than it had in years, united by the same realization. They had all experienced pieces of the same problem without recognizing it. Then the moment came that shifted everything. 2 patrol vehicles stopped outside the WA office again, this time accompanied by detectives. No sirens, no drama, just calm, deliberate movement. Officers entered with paperwork in hand, and for the next hour the door stayed closed. When they finally walked out, they carried more than just documents. They carried evidence. The WA representative followed behind, visibly shaken, speaking quietly with one of the detectives. No one heard the conversation, but the message was clear: this had moved beyond a community dispute. As the sun set, the street glowed orange with evening light. Neighbors stood together watching the officers leave, realizing they were witnessing the turning point. The story that started with a complaint about blocked streets had transformed into something much bigger. For the first time, it felt like justice wasn't just possible. It was coming, and the next chapter would decide how it all ended. The announcement came quietly, but its impact hit like thunder. An official community briefing would be held that evening, with police present. No one needed to say why. Everyone already knew this was the moment when questions would finally get answers. By sunset, the community hall was packed tighter than ever before. The atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. There was no shouting, no chaos, just anticipation. People sat forward in their chairs, waiting. My platoon members and I stood near the back again, watching silently. Officer Daniels and 2 detectives arrived together, carrying folders thicker than before. When the meeting started, the room fell completely silent. The WA representative took the front first. She looked tired, her usual confidence replaced by strain. She attempted to explain that misunderstandings had escalated unfairly and that all actions were meant to protect the neighborhood. But this time, people didn't nod along. They waited for the police to speak. Detective Harris stepped forward calmly. He explained that after reviewing records, dispatch logs, and witness statements, investigators found repeated discrepancies between WA complaints and actual conditions. Several reports made to law enforcement were exaggerated or unsupported. Financial records also showed irregular enforcement practices targeting specific residents. A collective murmur swept through the room. The detective didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone personally yet. Instead, he laid out facts, dates, patterns, numbers. Hearing everything connected in a clear timeline was overwhelming. Events that once seemed isolated suddenly formed one long chain. Then came the moment nobody expected. A former board member stood up voluntarily and admitted that enforcement decisions were often influenced by personal disagreements. He described meetings where pressure tactics were discussed openly. His voice shook as he spoke, but the honesty shifted the room's energy completely. The WA representative tried to interrupt, but the detectives asked her to remain seated. For the first time, power had clearly changed sides. Residents began asking questions rapidly, about fines they paid, letters they received, warnings they feared. Each question added weight to the realization that the system many trusted had quietly worked against them. Officer Daniels stepped forward and explained the next steps. The case had been escalated for further review, and certain enforcement actions were being suspended immediately. He emphasized that the goal wasn't punishment for its own sake, but accountability and fairness. Relief washed over the room. Some neighbors looked angry, others looked emotional. A few simply sat quietly, processing everything they had endured. As the meeting ended, no one rushed out. People lingered, talking openly in ways they never had before. The tension that had defined the neighborhood for so long felt like it was finally breaking. Outside, under streetlights, residents stood together, not divided by rules anymore, but connected by shared experience. I watched the WA representative leave quietly, surrounded by silence rather than authority. That's when I realized something. The investigation wasn't just exposing wrongdoing. It was returning power back to the community. And the final chapter would decide what happened next, not just to the WA, but to everyone who lived here. Because once the truth comes out, there's only one question left. What do you do with it? The final chapter didn't begin with sirens or shouting. It began with silence, the kind that settles after a storm when people realize the danger has passed but the impact remains. The neighborhood gathered one last time in the community hall, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to see how the story would end. Police stood quietly at the back, no longer investigating but present to ensure transparency. Officer Daniels nodded to familiar faces, the tension from earlier meetings replaced by calm professionalism. My platoon members and I stayed near the entrance, watching the same community that once felt divided now sit together without fear. The meeting opened with a simple announcement. Effective immediately, Law Enforcement Authority was suspended pending restructuring. Financial reviews confirmed misuse of procedures, and external oversight would manage future decisions. Certain fines were voided. Some payments would be returned. Residents could finally breathe again. The room exhaled as one. No cheering, just relief. The WA representative spoke briefly, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard. She admitted that decisions meant to maintain order had crossed lines and created harm. It wasn't a dramatic confession, but it was enough. The power she once held had disappeared, not through force, but through truth. One neighbor stood and thanked the police for listening. Another thanked the residents who spoke up despite fear. Then an elderly man, the same one who once said he preferred staying invisible, smiled and said, "Maybe we should have talked to each other sooner." Laughter followed, light but meaningful. After the formalities ended, people didn't rush home. They stayed, forming small circles of conversation. Strangers introduced themselves. Apologies were exchanged. Stories that had been hidden for months came into the open without judgment. Outside, the night felt peaceful. I stepped into the street and looked around. The same parked cars, the same sidewalks, the same houses that had witnessed arguments, accusations, and flashing lights. Yet everything felt different now. Officer Daniels joined me quietly. "You know," he said, "this started because someone thought the street was blocked." I laughed softly. "It wasn't the street," I said. "It was the community." He nodded. The real obstruction had been fear. Fear of speaking up, fear of consequences, fear of breaking silence. Once that lifted, everything else began moving again. As neighbors walked home, I noticed something small but powerful. People waved to each other. Conversations continued across driveways. The tension that once lived here was gone, replaced by something stronger: trust. My platoon members began leaving one by one, mission complete without ever needing to act as officers. We were just neighbors now, part of the same story. The night ended quietly, just like it began. No dramatic arrests, no shouting victories, just accountability, understanding, and a community choosing to rebuild itself. And as I looked down the now peaceful street, one thought stayed with me. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise.
Sometimes it shows up when people family decide to stand together and keep the road ahead clear for everyone. The complaint that was want to create trouble had done the opposite. It brought the neighborhood back to life. Welcome to Karen Universe, where we dive into every wild, quirky, and intriguing story out there. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.